I'm joined today by Dr. Josh Rasmussen, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. His area of expertise is in analytic metaphysics with a focus on the foundations of existence and the philosophy of mind. He is author of several books, including Defending the Corresponding Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence, and How Reason Can Lead to God, which we actually discussed in a few previous shows. He's also started the Worldview Design platform to help people build their worldview, and Dr. Rasmussen values collaboration across disciplines and perspectives. Dr. Josh Rasmussen, welcome back to the Classical Theism podcast.
Thank you. It's so cool to be with you again, John. Thanks.
Well, we're talking about a new book that you're working on. So You've been doing a lot of great work lately. And I first heard about it when you were discussing it on our good friend, the Pat Flynn show with our good friend, Pat Flynn. And it just got me so interested. The way you were laying out the tools and the thoughts, I'm like, man, I got to reach out to Josh and see if he'll come on to talk about this. But why don't you lay it out a little bit for the readers and the listeners? What's this forthcoming book about, and what are your hopes for it?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very excited to be working on this book on the nature of consciousness. And the working title is Who Are You Really? It's an investigation into your nature and your ultimate origin. And what I'm really trying to understand is how we can inspect our natures through our own lights, the powers that we have within us. And so I take some time to talk about tools that we have to investigate who we are. I talk about this in connection with the latest science, but I also want people to see how they can actually analyze the latest science with tools. So for example, I'm talking about consciousness. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately is how I can inspect my own consciousness just by looking within my own mind and noticing, oh, I'm thinking something, or, oh, I'm having a certain feeling. And it's interesting, John, I think people underestimate what you can find out about consciousness by just paying attention to your own consciousness right within. And there are hypotheses that you can test and investigate by paying attention. This is where I actually don't talk about this in the book yet, unless I add this in at some point, but there is this information, integrated information theory of consciousness that depends specifically on paying attention to consciousness and then verifying certain axioms of consciousness that then they use to investigate the nature of your mind. So that's really what I'm interested in doing. I want people to see the powers they have, to look within, to understand who they are. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to help people to use those tools to see something significant about who they are. I really think that there are significant treasures that you can see right within. Your own existence is extraordinarily significant, but there are these barriers that block us from seeing those things. Or even if we do see some of those things, there are barriers that actually block us from believing what we see. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that. But I do think that you can see some clear things just by turning on the light of introspection, looking within, and then paying attention to that. So that's what motivates me to write the book. And it's been a lot of fun. It's a big project. I'm trying to tackle many different parts: your thoughts, your feelings, your power to choose, yourself. What is that? How you relate to your body, how that works. And then I talk about these problems of how you can construct a being like you. I go through a series of different problems: this identity problem, the binding problem, construction problem, number of problems. And I have to tell you, John, thinking about those problems has changed my own thinking, because I really want to get to the truth. Like, how can a being like me get constructed? And all the problems, in a way, narrow the constraints. Like, okay, it can't be this way, can't be that way, can't. Okay, well, how is it even possible? And I get to this point, it's like, I shouldn't even exist. Like, there should be, reality should have never produced me. Like, I could not exist. But then I find my way within the narrow constraints to find a possible account of my ultimate origin. So that's been exciting for me to even change my own thinking about this topic.
Well, it sounds like a huge project and really exciting. The fact that you're, investigating philosophy of mind, but that you're also interacting with the scientific theories and doing a lot of just reflecting on your own thoughts and how things come across. You mentioned barriers that people sometimes have to this. And I think one of the barriers is that the topic is, too difficult unless you have, some degree in neuroscience or you've studied all these theories for years and for centuries. ordinary people can't understand this stuff. But like you
Yeah,
said, you're trying to give people the tools to do so.
that's
So can
it.
you talk to us a little bit about that? Like, what are the tools that you explain in the opening chapters that you're going to
Yeah.
use throughout the book?
Yeah. So I talk about three tools. One is introspection. Another is reason. And then the other is using a kind of scientific method. And I talk about how we can use those tools in tandem. So let me just talk about introspection a bit, because this is the tool that I believe gives you the clearest observations about consciousness, about the inner life, from which then you can use reason to deduce implications from those observations. And then you can independently check those things through a kind of peer-reviewed scientific method. So to illustrate introspection, consider like what you're thinking about right now. Okay. What are you thinking about, John? What are you thinking about?
Well, when you said that, I started to think about something. And so I pictured a glass of cold water.
Okay. How do you know? How do you know
Well,
that's what you did?
I guess I just have an immediate awareness of what I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I would say as well. So now let me go ahead and picture something. So this happens all the time. I try to come up with a thought and I start thinking about my wife. So I did it again. Okay. I'm thinking that she's beautiful. Now the thing about this is I'm reporting this thought that I'm having within, and I'm not checking the external material world. Now, I'm not like looking at my facial expression to figure out what I'm thinking about. Now, maybe I could look at your facial expression, maybe to anticipate what you're thinking or feeling. But when it comes to my own thoughts, I just like look within. It's like, I'm not lying. I really was thinking about my wife right then. And for some reason, now I just have like a picture of her in a dress and I'm just imagining her spinning. Okay. So these are things going on. And I'm able to make distinctions between different aspects of these thoughts right within my mind. I don't have to look at my hands. I don't have to look at my face. I don't even have to look at my brain, right? Like I don't have to open up my brain and see, okay, how are the molecules moving? Oh, when molecules do this, when axons fire like this, that's correlated according to neuroscience with certain kind of thinking. So now that I see what my brain is doing, I can figure out what I'm thinking. It's like, no, I have another way to see what I'm thinking through, and that this is what I call introspection. It's that light within by which you can just see exactly what you're thinking. Not in all detail necessarily. Maybe I shouldn't even say exactly, but you can at least see something within you about what you're thinking and feeling. And so this is an important tool. And if you don't use this tool, then you run into this problem. I call it the darkness problem. It's the problem that your mind goes completely dark. And it's completely dark, meaning you can't see anything within your own consciousness. So you can't even see that your mind is dark. In other words, you can't even see that you're having a doubt about whether you can see anything, because doubts themselves are contents of consciousness. You know, like because you might wonder, well, can we really trust introspection to reveal reality? Maybe introspection just reveals illusions within your own mind. But wait a minute, how would you even know the experience of an illusion? How would you even know what an illusion is unless you have some light inside of your mind to have the sensation of having an illusion, or to have the sense of a thought that I'm not seeing reality? Thoughts, sensations, even illusions. Illusions are a kind of experience that doesn't match outer reality. So you would only know that you are experiencing an illusion if you at least knew that you were having an experience. And you only know that through the light of introspection, looking within.
Okay, so
there's one
yeah,
of my tools.
that's helpful. The tool of introspection, which you have kind of situated for us, not as necessarily providing always unambiguous and an exact understanding of things, though sometimes maybe it does do that, but also it's not, we can't posit utter darkness because
Yes,
that turns out to be incoherent. So we at least have an introspection powerful enough to examine what we're thinking about, what we're aware of, and so forth, even if it's not necessarily hyper powerful where it's perfect, but
that's right.
we can't have utter darkness because then we get incoherence. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
one of the tools. And then, yeah, what you want to run through the others?
Yeah. And just before I move ahead here, I like how you put that in terms of you can have some sight, even if you don't have perfect sight. Sometimes I think about it like looking through a cracked window. The window could have cracks, so maybe you're not seeing everything perfectly clearly through the window, but you're seeing something. If you didn't see anything, again, if you didn't see anything at all, then everything would be blank. You wouldn't even see that you're not seeing. You wouldn't even have any sense of anything. Sometimes people talk about science as the real window into reality, but science is based on observations. One of the things I talk about in the book is that introspection is bedrock to science itself, because you actually need introspection to be able to know that you're even making an observation. Because think about it, like you use your eyeballs to observe shapes and colors, but you use introspection to observe or to sense that you're observing shapes and colors. That's a subtle distinction, but there's a difference between seeing shapes and colors with your eyes and seeing the sense of shapes and colors. And that sense of shapes and colors is something that you see with introspection. So in other words, in order to even do observations, you have to be able to look within, but you don't have to have perfect sight to have some sight. So I think that's an important point. I don't know if I want to say more about that, but the reason why I take so much time talking about and writing about introspection, that part of the book, and defending it against certain objections and worries, and making some distinctions and making the point that it doesn't have to be infallible to give you some information, is because once you turn on the light of introspection, you can begin to see some things. I'm just going to put this boldly. You can begin to see some things that challenge certain philosophical views about the nature of the world we're in. And in fact, I can just tell you from personal conversations I've had with philosophers at conferences, multiple different occasions, where the philosophers are reporting skepticism about the light of introspection precisely because it casts doubt on some of these other philosophical accounts. And we'll come back to this as we talk about the implications of what you can see. But this is part of the reason why I think it's really important to take some time and think about, are there reasons to doubt introspection? Sometimes people cite science as evidence that you can misperceive what you're thinking. You can misperceive what you're experiencing. And we have a scientific way of figuring that out. And there I want to, in some ways, grant that, yes, I mean, we can misperceive things we see with our eyes. I can misperceive things that I read, right? And so I think that does invite intellectual humility. I think that's important. But if we turn the light off completely, so you can't see anything, then you have that darkness problem. Then you cut off the light to even knowing that you're observing a scientific report, that you're even reading a scientific report. You cut off any kind of way of even having awareness of reasons to think that introspection is not reliable, because reasons themselves are parts of consciousness. You witness them by introspection. You see your own reasons in your own mind. And so I hope I'm not belaboring this too much. It's such an important tool to get started. And then once we have this light, I talk about going into the cave of consciousness, because then we can begin to illuminate the different aspects within. Now we can use reason. So the next tool I talk about here is the light of reason. And I think of this as the tool by which we can make deductions from our observations. So for example, we can deduce, this is maybe a simple case, that if I'm observing something that's green, then I'm not thereby observing something that's not green. Okay, that maybe seem obvious, but I like to point to the obvious things because I think the obvious things, sometimes people think they're too obvious to appreciate their significance. But just because it's obvious doesn't mean that it's not insignificant. What I actually just said there, even though it may be obvious that if it's green, it's not green, that's something that applies anywhere in all of the universe, in all of reality. So you can actually look through your telescope, your logic telescope, and you can see that everywhere in all of reality, if something's green over there, it's not also not green. Okay. And you say, oh, that's sort of trivial, but no, but that implies that you can know things about the outer reaches of reality, at least some things. And that's not a trivial bit of knowledge, that you can know that the outer reaches of reality are not contradictory. The outer reaches of reality aren't green and not green. They're not green and colorless. And that opens up the door. What else can we know? But here, I don't want to rush ahead too quickly. I just want to invite the reader and the listener to consider that by the light of reason, we actually don't see by the light of reason the limits of reason. So it's not like there's this grand proof that's been deduced by logic that says, here's what logic can prove, and logic can't prove anything else. Now, maybe, let me just qualify that a little bit. I mean, there are some places in mathematics where you can prove that something can't be proven, right? But that's different than proving that here's all the things that reason can demonstrate, and we can now demonstrate that reason cannot demonstrate anything else. That demonstration has not been created as far as I've seen. Okay, so that always
Wait,
kind
that's
of
a
leaves
fun
things open.
distinction. Wait, that's a fun
Yes.
distinction to think about. First of all, you're saying a ton of great things, and I'm gonna let you actually walk us through more of those basic important things that we can know just with introspection. But you're laying out the tools of introspection,
Yes,
reason. I'll let you talk about the scientific method in a second. But that's a fun distinction that you just talked about. Yes, because as an undergrad, I remember learning about there being incompleteness theorems that we could prove that you aren't able to prove everything using a certain
yes,
set of axioms and so on. So some things couldn't be proven one way or the other given a certain framework. But then there were other things like Goldbach's conjecture
yeah.
that I think it's that any prime number. Oh no, sorry. Is it any even number is the sum of two primes, or it might be the other way around. Uh, any prime number is the no. I think it's any even number is the sum of two primes.
You mentioned you
Let's
want to look
Google
at
that
that.
real
That
quick
sounds right. Yeah,
now that
yeah,
we're on Zoom. But there's this
yeah,
other set of things that are conjectures. Yeah, I'm going to
yeah.
check it myself as well. That's kind of embarrassing. But this was in our discrete math class. Don't tell Dr.
Yeah,
Conjura.
every even counting number greater than 2 is equal to the sum of 2 prime numbers. So
Equal to the sum of
that's
two
right.
prime
Yeah,
number. Oh, that's what it is. Okay, every even number greater than 2 is equal to the sum of two primes. And that was a conjecture. Do we
yeah,
know if it's true or not? No. Do we know if we can prove it or not? No. So what you're pointing out is just with the light of
yeah.
reason doesn't tell us all the
The
things that can
limits.
be proven or all the limits or all the things that can be disproven. That's really an interesting point that connects with me as a math teacher going through these conjectures. And it
Yeah,
also
reason does not reveal its own limit in power to reveal.
yes.
Maybe it reveals some limits, but it doesn't reveal all of its limits. At least it hasn't. I mean, no human being has
Right.
charted the limits of reason. So here's how far reason can go and no farther. So I'm like, well, let's keep exploring. Let's keep shining. Maybe we can shine over here and over here and over here. I have to tell you, John, like the more that I've used the light of reason, shine it on different places, parts and wholes, not just sets and numbers and shapes. We learned that in math, like that's canonical because we get geometry, numbers and shapes, and sets. We think, we know that, right? But then you've got the logic of parts and wholes, the logic of possibility and necessity, the logic of consciousness. Now we've got theorems. I deduce a theorem we're going to talk about, but in the integrated information theory, those axioms have now supplied resources for deducing theorems about consciousness. This is recent stuff. And this is very recent stuff for human beings to apply the light of reason to some of these things. And so it's very cool to see what we can discover.
I like that. So we were talking a moment ago about how reason cannot see its own limits. Maybe it's able to peek around and see even more and even more, but it does have the power to see certain specific things. So
That's
it
it.
has that power, and you're going to help us with that. It has that power to see certain specific things, just like introspection has that power to see certain specific things, even if it's not perfect. And reason, even if it's not been, unlimitedly exhausted into all its realms, we can
Yes.
still know when we're latching on to certain things. Like you said, that if you recognize something as green, we can know it's not green, and that this plot applies to the outer edges of
We can
the
know that it's
universe.
not green.
That is not green.
just,
That's it.
just so
Yes.
that the audience doesn't, if it's green, we can know it's therefore not green.
Oh yeah,
Just
that would be.
sure we get that clear.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what?
Yeah.
Sometimes I just try to talk too fast and I miss it, but that extra not is very important. Do you
Yeah.
want to say something really quick about the scientific method, and then I want you to walk us through some of those more
Yes,
things we can
I
know.
do. I'm glad you're mentioning that here because some people listening to this might be even kind of worried that I'm getting a little bit too excited, about reason and its powers, and there is this very real worry, an important worry about philosophers kind of spinning webs of reason, sort of out in the land of imagination or whatever, and we're always debating things, So who knows what we can deduce, and it's not anchored to the sort of concrete observations. So it's like science works, science gives us technologies, science is based on observations. If you just use reason untethered to concrete observations, then you become a philosopher. You don't produce any technologies. You just keep debating things, right? So that's an important worry, and I want to just highlight that because what that worry does for me is it invites me to work with all the different tools. So I don't want to just use reason. I actually want to use a kind of scientific method where I'm coming up with hypotheses and I'm testing them. Now, I think that we can test some hypotheses through the light of introspection. We'll talk a bit about this perhaps as we go, but one of the hypotheses is called eliminativism, eliminativist materialism. And the eliminativist materialism says that the vocabulary of physics describes real attributes of reality, and that all other attributes of reality can be analyzed ultimately in terms of material reality. And then furthermore, consciousness is not itself describable just by describing things in our physics, by describing electrons and protons and electric fields. You're not thereby describing all of the aspects of thoughts, if there were thoughts. So Alexander Rosenberg is one example of a philosopher of science, who makes an argument for this hypothesis of eliminativist materialism, specifically eliminating thoughts, saying there are no thoughts, at least as we understand them intuitively, as things that can be about things. Like I can think about Smurfs, for example. Leptons are not about Smurfs. They're not about anything. And so there is this hypothesis that says reality is fundamentally material and there is no consciousness. Now, I actually think it is possible to test this hypothesis by making observations through the light of introspection. This is why I take some time to talk about this light and why it's so important that you can actually see some things within you. You can see your own thoughts, something about your own thoughts. You can see some feelings within you. This is the eliminativist thesis is not the reductive thesis. Sometimes people confuse those. They say, oh, well, the philosophers who are eliminating consciousness are actually reducing consciousness to material brain states. That's a different hypothesis, and we can talk about that. But I like to separate the hypotheses so we can focus on one at a time. The eliminativist hypothesis is saying, no, there aren't any thoughts. There aren't any feelings if we eliminate feelings. And so I think that we can now use the scientific method to ask, okay, well, what would follow from that hypothesis? What does that hypothesis predict? Well, one thing that it would predict is that I wouldn't be able to distinguish happy emotions from sad emotions. Because let's think about this together, John. And you can correct me if I'm wrong at any point. I always tell my audience and my students, don't believe anything that I tell you just because I'm telling you. Just check it for yourself. Okay, so here's how I'm thinking about it. Here's a little argument. Premise one, I can distinguish my own feeling of happiness from my own feeling of sadness. Okay. Premise two would be, if I can distinguish a feeling of happiness from a feeling of sadness, then I can have a feeling of happiness and a feeling of sadness. If I can have a feeling of happiness, then there is a feeling of happiness. But if eliminativist materialism is true, then there are no feelings at all, and therefore there's no feeling of happiness. Now, so I'm testing eliminativist materialism by first making a prediction. If eliminativist materialism is true, then I don't even have the feeling of happiness, and I don't have any thoughts, and I can't distinguish happiness from sadness. So that's the prediction. And then now I believe that by introspection, I can make an observation of my own happiness right within and disconfirm the hypothesis directly. Now, I don't want to say that, that's sort of the only thing that can be said about this, that eliminativists would have no response to that. There's a fun dialectical game that's, I think, helpful. When I say game, I don't mean to trivialize it. I mean, it's an important dialectical exchange between the eliminativists and the realists that I think can help clarify what's at stake. And in the book, I take some time to walk through that dialectic. But ultimately, the argument here is that we can use a scientific method, we can come up with a hypothesis, we can tease out a prediction, and then we can make an observation to test that prediction. And so
I think that's
basically my method.
I like that example of how you're using the three tools. So you had the scientific method, you're making the hypothesis, but then to get those premises on the table, at least some of them, you had to look within yourself to say, okay, in my own awareness, sometimes I feel happy, sometimes I feel sad, and I know what that's like. and then combine that together in the right sort of way with your tool of reason,
That's it.
and you get a conclusion that's relevant to the hypothesis. So that's a great little example that I think all of us can do who are following along. And I did check your work on that. I totally do
It made
agree
sense
with
to your
that
mind. Yeah.
conclusion.
Yeah.
That yes, I do check
And
with
maybe
checking
that
with
means
those
we're both
premises.
wrong, John. Maybe we're both on the wrong ship, right? So
We invite
but
the listeners to test it for
that's
themselves.
it.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
can you do a few more of those? I was just curious, like things that we can know about,
Mm,
basic things we can know about our own consciousness and minds. I guess we haven't used the word mind a ton yet. Just
yeah.
using those tools that you've laid out. What are some other things that we can know? And then we'll get into some of your more specific work on
Yeah.
thoughts themselves.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go for the reductive thesis, and I'm going to just kind of let myself loose and be bold about kind of how I think about it, with all respect for those who may see things differently. And let me just say that I used to think I used to have a different view on this. I remember when I was in college talking with somebody about consciousness and thoughts and feelings, and saying to them that even if we can't understand how certain feelings correlate with the brain, give science enough time, and in principle, we could build machines that can think and feel. Now that actually might be right. Maybe we could build machines that can think and feel. But what I was missing in my analysis was a distinction between the thinking and feeling being nothing but neurons firing versus the thinking and feeling being intimately correlated with neurons firing, maybe even produced somehow by neurons firing. And it wasn't until I got to graduate school that I began taking courses in the philosophy of mind. I took 5 or 6 different courses by different philosophers: Jaegwon Kim from Brown University, Alvin Plantinga, J.P. Moreland, Michael Tooley, Robert Hand, number of different philosophers. Um, um, and that really helped me to make these distinctions. And one of the things that I began to see was that by observing my own consciousness, I can actually observe some things about my consciousness that make certain aspects of my consciousness, I think, evidently distinct from certain aspects of material states. And just to draw this out a bit, well, here's some props. Props will help. All right, so here I have 2 little bits of reality. Okay, one bit of reality is, let's say, a blue, or at least looks bluish, and the other is green. And you might ask, like, are these the same bits of reality? Like, maybe they're the same bit of reality, but just viewed from 2 different perspectives. Maybe that's the case, because Lois can sort of view Clark Kent from one perspective and then view Superman, who's the same person, from another perspective. Or water is H2O, maybe from one perspective, but you don't know that it's H2O from another perspective. So are these bits of reality like Clark Kent? Is it like water? Or is it like, instead it's like you and me, John, like you're not me, you're over there, I'm over here. How could we tell that these are different? Well, I think that we can actually see some differences that imply that these can't be the same thing. One difference here is that I can be acquainted with aspects of this without thereby being acquainted with this bit of reality over here. And I'm actually aware of or acquainted with my acquaintance of this. And I'm aware of it, and I'm acquainted with my non-acquaintance of the other. But if these were the same reality, then by the law of identity, everything true of this would have to be true of this. Because they're the same thing. And so if it's true that I'm acquainted with this, then it's also true that I'm acquainted with this. But look, I'm acquainted with this, but I'm not acquainted with the other. Now, one thing that's a little bit tricky about these examples is that supposedly these are objects that would exist even apart from my own consciousness. And so you could maybe hypothesize that maybe I actually am experiencing the same reality as blue with one eye, and as green, I guess, with the same eye, but it's just like somehow it's just the same reality manifesting in my consciousness. But when it comes to things right within your consciousness, I think you can even get a clearer test. I call this the comparison test, the direct comparison test. So to illustrate the test, and then want to apply it to the reductionist thesis that reduces consciousness to nothing but brain states. But just to illustrate the test, I mentioned happiness and sadness a moment ago. Well, how do you know that a sad state is different from a happy state? How do you even know that? Well, I think that you can know it through introspection and you can actually witness directly sadness and happiness being different. Same thing if I think about the thought about zebras and the thought about my wife. Yes, you're closing your eyes. You're actually confirming. I love this. You're checking in your own mind to see, do I see this? The thought about zebras, thought about my wife, emotion of happiness. Those are three different things. Those are not the same thing.
Right.
Direct comparison. Black and white, not the same thing. True and false, not the same thing. Direct comparison. I think you can actually compare these things because you can actually be aware of these things directly within your own consciousness. You can actually be aware of truth in your own consciousness, falsehood in your own consciousness. You can compare them. Black and white, you can compare them. So now I can actually compare some aspects of consciousness with purely third-person material brain states, and I believe that I can see difference. I like to focus on like examples and then just generalize. Like, so imagine there's a neuron firing and it takes a certain shape. I want to say the shape of a triangle. I know that's too simple, but I mean, whatever shape it takes, right? A total shape or configuration, or we could apply it to functions, however we want to describe it, then I can compare that shape with the feeling of smelling coffee or the happiness feeling or the thought of 2 + 2 = 4. And even though these are perhaps deeply correlated, deeply connected, maybe like two sides of the same coin, they're not the same side. And my reason for thinking this is that I can be aware of the one reason for thinking this is I can be aware of the one directly, immediately within my consciousness without thereby being aware of the other. Another reason is maybe just more direct. I just see that triangularity and feeling happy aren't the same. I'm directly acquainted with that in the same way that I'm directly acquainted with truth and falsehood not being the same. I've become very convinced on this. I mean, I'll just confess to you, John, I'm no less sure that consciousness doesn't reduce to purely third-person description of brains than I am that I have consciousness. Those are the same. And I'm more sure of these things, and I'm being completely honest, I'm more sure of these things than I am that you exist or that the earth is even round. And I'm just very honest about this because, and it's because of direct acquaintance with these things. And it wasn't immediate. And I don't claim that you have to be this degree of certainty or anything like that. But for me, it was just once I cleared away the distinctions, it was like I cleared away the barrier so that I could actually believe what I was already seeing all along. I mean, it's like going back to the limitivists, there's a sense in which you become skeptical that there are thoughts and feelings, even while you're directly acquainted with thoughts and feelings in your own experience. Then you become skeptical that thoughts and feelings are distinct from brain states, even while you're directly acquainted with thoughts and feelings without acquainted with any brain states at all. You're directly acquainted with distinctions there, right in your own mind.
I love how this is what I love about your work, Josh, because you're really empowering us to kind of see this for ourselves. And again, even if people don't see it yet with the amount of certainty that you were just saying, I think it is very clear what I kind of took away as you were explaining that example of the different bits of matter and then the three different things we were pondering and how they're not the same, is that tight correlation is not the same thing as identity.
That's it.
There could be tight correlations without identity because we get the tight correlations, I'm going to be honest, thrown in our face a lot. Like, well, look at all these experiments, look at all of this. And a lot of undergraduates experience it all the time and all the tight correlations. But that can show just because things are intimately connected doesn't mean that our consciousness is nothing but the neurons firing, nothing but what's going on in the brains. And I think you've made that distinction well, and that is something we can visualize with that prop that you have there.
These are correlated. When I move, I'm only touching the green and I'm moving the green, but the blue moves with it because I've attached them, right? And there could be a question about how did I attach it, but somehow they're attached. Now I'm moving the blue and the green is moving. I can spin the one and the other spins. They're deeply correlated. Okay, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. I mean, look, even as a mathematician, you'd appreciate this. Like even the triangularity of a triangle is not the same as the trilaterality of the triangle. The trilaterality is the three sides. The triangularity is the three angles. But those are correlated. In fact, necessarily and conceptually, if you have three sides together, you're going to have three angles. And if you have three angles, you have three sides. But they're still not the same thing.
Yes.
And seeing that, I think I make this point, John, and when I talk about eliminativists, I think the eliminativists are seeing that. They're seeing that if consciousness were real, it would be over and above material states.
Mm.
That's what they're saying. They're actually agreeing with the non-reductionists that if consciousness were not just an illusion, if it were actually real, then it would be more than just matter. So if everything is just matter, then consciousness can't be real by this eliminativist argument. But I think that's actually what the eliminativist gets right. They get right that if consciousness is real, it's not reducible to matter. Searle makes this point. I mean, he thinks
Yeah, I was going to bring this up. I didn't want to get too technical, but if you want to go here, he does say exactly that consciousness is not ontologically reducible to material brain states. And he has a distinction that I don't know if we want to go in here, where he doesn't think it's ontologically reducible in the sense that it's identical to it, but he thinks it can be shown to be causally reducible to the brain states. And he has this analogy like he likes to throw out with tables being solid. And we can look at a table at the macro level, it's solid, but if we reduce it down to its molecules and its tiny parts, we don't necessarily apply the principle of, or the characterization of solid to those little tiny bits. Yet the whole thing is solid. So he kind of has a more nuanced view. But you were just pointing out that he does reject the identity view.
That's right. In fact, he says he actually thinks it is no better than elimination. Like once you really understand what consciousness is from the inside, to say that all that is just chemical reactions or functions, even functions of material states. I mean, he's famous for arguing against functionalism. It's like, this isn't, the consciousness may have functional properties. It may perform a function in the brain for sure, but it doesn't mean that it just is the function of third person material states. And if you just take a bunch of Legos and you get them to function in a certain way, that's not the same thing as, even if it's causally related to, it's not the same thing as the feeling of smelling coffee. Yes. So he does make that point. And I appreciate that he draws it out, because I think what a lot of people don't necessarily realize outside the field is that the philosophers who are marshaling the arguments against materialism are naturalist, non-theist, non-religious philosophers. Okay, these aren't.
Yeah, there's no way people think that. If you said that on an undergrad campus, there's no way they would think that.
Yeah, it's helpful for you to even remind me of that, because I think I'm so seeped into the academic culture, I forget that outside of the academic culture, there's an impression that people who are arguing against materialists are maybe hyper zealous theists or religious people who maybe are skeptical of science or something like this. And it's like, oh my goodness, it's completely opposite. You have, we'll get into the science, and you have a lot of interesting scientific evidence that's breaking the materialist frame. And it's atheist scientists talking about this, okay? But then in the philosophy side, and this is where I'm the most familiar with, you have David Chalmers. I talked with Philip Goff recently about consciousness. You've got Bernardo Kastrup. You have a lot of philosophers, including philosophers who would call themselves physicalists. I was going to make this point about John Searle. He would call himself a physicalist, okay? But even in his usage of the word physical, it's not what people outside the academy necessarily think, because he's saying that consciousness doesn't reduce to the sort of third person properties studied by physics. He thinks that there's irreducible subjectivity embedded in reality. And he just calls it physical because he has a definition of physical in terms of this sort of causal constraint. But yeah, so you've got a lot of philosophers arguing that consciousness is real and even fundamental to reality, and that materialism, a kind of bottom-up mindless materialism, just doesn't work. And these philosophers from many different quarters are, again, they're not coming at it from a religious standpoint. I mean, for many of them, it's against their own original view. Philip Goff tells this story of not being a theist and, in fact, eliminating consciousness for a while. And then he's at a bar or a pub or something, and he's listening to the music, and he's kind of enjoying the music, and he's just noticing his own experience. He's like, you know what? It's actually undeniable that I'm having an experience, that I actually have consciousness, that there's something real there. And this kind of breaks the frame. It actually ends up leading him ultimately on the path to thinking of consciousness as part of the fundamental building blocks of reality. It's sort of fundamental to reality.
Yeah, those are a ton of great points. I want to say, I'm glad you clarified that too about Searle's view. That's right. He says that things are causally reducible to the physical, but he allows for things to have higher order features
That's it.
that
Yeah.
we don't just see in the physical thing. So that his
Yeah.
view is very nuanced. I want to spend some time, Josh, if we can, on your
Yeah.
thoughts about thoughts. I'll put it that
Yeah.
way, because you got a whole chapter diving into thoughts. I don't think we'll be able to do all of it justice just in this interview, but I want to go there next, and then maybe we'll close with a consideration about some of the scientific stuff that you said is
Yeah.
very
That sounds
exciting.
good.
So,
Yeah.
let's start here. What are some of the thoughts? What are thoughts, and what are some of the characteristics about thoughts that you unpack using those different tools?
Yeah, that's good. So I invite the reader to just, again, use that tool of introspection, inspect the familiar. Your thoughts are familiar, but they're not insignificant. So inspect them. What do you notice? And I notice several different aspects that I I highlight. So one of them is thoughts have this kind of aboutness to them. So if I'm thinking about cheese, I have a thought in my own mind about cheese, but the thought is sort of directed to something outside my mind. There's not cheese literally in my mind right now. Okay. Well, sometimes I can also have thoughts about other parts of my mind. I've had dreams where in my dream, I was thinking about another part of my dream or previous dream. So you can have thoughts about other things in your mind, but thoughts have that kind of aboutness flavor to them. And so there's a big question, what is that? How do we analyze it? But here I'm just observing that there is that aboutness. And by the way, and I'm observing that, again, not by looking at atoms in a brain, the concept of aboutness. People sometimes talk about maps representing things, but we only understand how a map represents something by already understanding the concept of an icon being about something else. And we don't get that by looking at shapes out there, right? We get that by looking within and noticing thoughts. Then we come up with shapes to represent other shapes, and we assign the links there with our minds. So there's aboutness, there's a truth value. So some thoughts, like I'm thinking now that I'm feeling happy, and I believe that's true because it's matching my emotional state. My thought that 2 + 2 = 25, that's false, doesn't match reality. Another part of thoughts is that there's a kind of a structure to it. So the thought that the cat is on the mat has a different structure than the thought that the mat is on the cat. They have the same conceptual ingredients, cat, about the mat, and the on, those 3 ingredients. But the mat is on the cat is different from the cat is on the mat. Mat is on the cat is on. So there's a structure that accounts for that difference. And we see the structure right within our own minds, right within thoughts. That's where we get the concept of structure. Or at least that's one source. Maybe we can also see structure in our visual imagery as well. I think that's true. This is, in fact, one of the axioms in the information theory about consciousness, is that consciousness has a structure to it. And then a fourth thing we notice within thoughts, or let's say I notice within thoughts, I invite you to consider this, is these kind of logical links. So you can have the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, or snow is white, and or is a kind of logical link. Now, or is one of those things. It's like we take it for granted, but reality gave rise to or, John. Or is real. How does or exist? Reality gave rise to or. That's a fascinating thing. So or is a reality. Now, you can theorize how you analyze or. Maybe you can analyze or in terms of something else, right? But at least there is an or, and I witness it right within my thoughts. And so or gives me a kind of linking relation that allows me to build more complex thoughts out of simpler thoughts. Same with and. And is another linking relation. So those are a few aspects of thoughts. Is anything you wanted to follow up on?
Yeah, just to clarify, because this is very helpful. We had aboutness, truth value, structure, and logical links. And so our thoughts, how do those relate to concepts? I know this is very hard just talking about these fundamental words, because they're just like, we're so well acquainted with them. Because before, when you asked me at the beginning of the interview, like, what was I thinking about? And I talked about the cold glass of water I thought about. I think in a lot of those occasions when we're asked to think about something, we start to use our visual powers and our visual imagery to see things in our mind's eye. Yeah. But I know thoughts, that's not all we're doing when we're thinking. Like you were talking about the cat on the mat, like we can analyze a sentence, we can think in words, and then we can also like kind of see the truth of a concept. Do all these fall under the umbrella of thinking, as you say it? Do you have a hierarchy of thoughts, as you put it, or how do you categorize them, and how does it relate to the word concept?
Yeah, I love that question. I think of concepts as building blocks for thoughts. So I have the concept of a mat, the concept of a cat, the concept of on. Those are three concepts. I believe I get those concepts through experience with realities. In fact, I actually think that your simple concepts you get through real experience with their application to reality. So if truth is a simple concept, then the way that I grasp that concept is by experiencing truth. Now, the concept of a unicorn, that's a more complex concept. So it combines like being a horn, being a horse, magical powers. So it combines those. So that combination may not apply to anything, but the atomic concepts, I think I get those by experience. Then once I get these atomic concepts, then they become building blocks, not just for complex concepts, but for what I'm going to call thought. So the difference between a complex concept and a thought in my vocabulary would be that a thought is an organization of concepts, whereas a complex concept is just a string of concepts added together by and. So like being an unmarried male, that's being unmarried and male. Being an unmarried male is not it's not yet a thought. A thought would be I am an unmarried male. Now that thought doesn't correspond to reality, but what makes that different from a concept is that it takes concepts and it organizes them with that structure, and then it can have a truth value. So there's a lot. There's probably more than what you're asking for, but I love to think about this because I like to think about these basic building blocks of my theory of everything. Okay. And so concepts, thoughts, emotions, all that, these are like pieces of my theory of everything. So I think a lot about how all of these things go together. And the way that I come up with my theory is, again, using introspection and just noticing, okay, I've got this concept. Here's a thought. How is it related to those concepts? Oh, it seems to be built up out of those concepts. There's an arrangement there. Thought has a truth value. That's very interesting. So yeah.
Okay. No, that is helpful on the terminology. I appreciate that. The distinction between complex concepts, just atomic or basic concepts added together, versus a thought, which has an organized structure. Yeah. Organized structure for those concepts. Okay. Given that, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this if we can. Maybe we'll say maybe around 10 minutes or so. You have this counting argument that you've been working on that deals with thoughts and things we were just talking about. What is this counting argument? And why don't we spend a little bit of time tracing some of the premises? I know you, and I'll link to this in the show notes. I know there's a lot of technical articles and things that have been produced. If people want to get all of that rigor, it's there in print and we can point them to that. But help us understand, what is this argument? What's it trying to show? And what are some of the key premises?
Yeah, so this is an argument that I got this sort of a seed idea. This was maybe about 10 years ago. And I was having a bowl of cereal and I was just thinking about thoughts and I was thinking about material states and I was like comparing them and thinking about them in my mind. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about the logical links between thoughts. And it occurred to me that the logical links are almost like a glue that allows you to build complex thoughts. And at this time, I was also thinking about different kinds of infinity, and I was thinking about how material states seem to be glued together by spatial relations, or maybe there's functional relations that can sort of glue together the material states. And all of a sudden, just in my mind, I just had this sort of idea that using the logical links, you can actually, in a sense, define or construct more types of thoughts than you could construct types of purely material states out of atoms. And even if both types are infinite in their totality, they're for technical reasons, you can get a bigger infinity of the kinds of thoughts than the kinds of material states. And maybe we can try to unpack that. But the basic idea is that you can count up more types of thoughts than types of material states. That was the seed. And then as I've been thinking about that seed, I began to unpack it in different ways. So it took about 10 years before my first publication. And I made this argument, this counting argument, from this sort of idea that you can get more thoughts than material states, that the thoughts don't reduce to the material states. So that was kind of my first idea. And then I had this other idea about, well, if you get more thoughts than material states, then there's not even a one-to-one relationship, so that each thought can be uniquely determined by some unique material state that determines that thought. So then I ended up coming up with this argument against even Searle's idea, or at least one version of it, that you can sort of causally get the thoughts out of micro physical states that aren't themselves mental. And then after that, I came up with another iteration, which is the more technical deduction that you saw. I worked on that with Andrew Bailey. And then now, as I've been working on my book, I actually found a way of simplifying some things, and I even got another idea to expand this further. It is actually kind of interesting because there's a little bit of a story about this seed. It took me a while to take that initial seed and turn it into a published paper. It took me about 10 years. And after about 2 years of working on it, I had presented it at some different conferences. But when I submitted it to get published, it would be reviewed by very, very good and helpful reviewers that pointed out problems with the argument that kind of made me think that maybe it wouldn't actually work in the end. But I couldn't see clearly that it couldn't work. And I felt like the seed still seemed like it could sprout. And so I wasn't really sure. So I was praying about it, John. I was like asking God, I was like, God, if there's something here, can you help me to sort of work this out, to think about it? And I felt like it was just one of those moments that kind of had that sort of inner voice say that the seed idea was from God. Like, I gave you that idea. And so then I was like, well, God, if you gave me the idea, why has it been so hard for me to publish it? And I felt like God said, well, because it's your idea to develop. I gave you the seed, it's yours to develop. And I'm never quite sure what to make of that kind of experience. I give it a certain probability, and it kind of depends on how it matches with external things or whatever. But it's interesting. I had that experience. And so then since then, I have been kind of developing new iterations of the argument. And I actually think it's an argument that hasn't been fully unpacked in all of its details. And maybe there are ways of cutting against certain versions and building certain others better. And so listeners can even look into this and maybe develop this in a way that's different and better than what I've seen so far. But that's kind of the seed, is that using the logical links. And this is the key thing. And I think even as I was writing the book, it became even clearer to me that you have to use introspection to pay attention to these aspects of thoughts in order to build the argument. You really do have to do that, because I think otherwise it will always be question begging in the end. I think in the end, you actually have to have some bit of sight into the nature of a thought. Even if you leave open whether that nature reduces to physical things, we can just leave that open, put the direct comparison test aside, put these other tests aside. Let's just think again about it. But you have to at least see that thoughts do have logical links. And that gives you the building power to construct the argument.
I really want to follow up on that, but I also want to respect your time, Josh. Do you have another 15, 20 minutes? If
I
not,
want to try to unpack it a bit more. Yeah. I mean, this is just kind of the beginning.
That was the beginning. No, but I just want to make sure, because I also want to have time to ask you a question about science.
I've got open time. Yeah.
All right.
For sure.
So then what I wanted to see, that was a great overview and setting the scene. But can you maybe using some props again, if you're able to, or just kind of show us the beginning steps of how this argument gets off the ground, the counting argument? What exactly are the premises here that you're using? You don't have to give us all the gory technical details, like we said, but get us started thinking about this for the listeners who are watching, and those who are listening will just have to look closely or check out the show notes for the video.
Yeah, and I just have to say this is difficult for me, so I don't know yet how to do this. So the technical version deduces a theorem. I'm thinking I want to call this the mindful thoughts theorem, at least my latest iteration of it. But there's this article that I co-authored with Andrew Bailey called How to Build a Thought. And there we have a symbolic demonstration from certain axioms to this theorem. And it's very, very technical. And even I don't have like the whole thing in my mind. I don't even know how to. It's like a sequence of steps that once you get up that step, you can take the next one. And then you find yourself at the top of the staircase. You're like, how did we get here from there? And it's like, well, logic deduces it. And that's the very interesting thing. So I'll try to give a little bit more of a flavor of it. So here, I'm going to just say that these blue things now are going to represent different types of thoughts. Okay. And these green things will represent different types of mindless material states. Okay. Now I say mindless on purpose because I want to consider the hypothesis now that we could generate all of mental reality from mindless beginnings, right? So because here's a story of the world. Reality begins with particles that are mindless, and there's no mind behind the beginning of those particles. but the particles rearrange in such a way that eventually produces mental reality. And one way of specifying this hypothesis is that the mindless determines the mental. That's a common way. It's not the only way, but that's a common way. So I want to think about that hypothesis: the mindless determines the mental. Now, what the counting argument seeks to show is that by thinking about logical links, you can actually define more types of thoughts, possible thoughts, than types of material states. And so that's why I have 3 types of thoughts over here and 3 types of material states over here. A way of kind of unpacking that argument a little bit is, for any collection of material states, one can define a thought that's about that collection and only that collection. One way you could do that is you could define a concept about each of the material states. So there's this material state, and then there's the concept of it. Then there's this material state, and then there's the concept of it. And then we can string the concepts together by a thought that thinks about all of those together. So what this gives us is at least as many types of thoughts as collections of material states. And now, to get very technical, we have Cantor's theorem, which tells us that there are going to be more collections of things than individual things. And even if you have an infinite number of things, there's more collections of that infinity. There's more, let's say, subsets of the set of things than individual things. And so what that will give us is that there are more collections of types of material states than there are types of material states, but there's at least one type of mental state, a thought about it, for each collection. And so then it follows that there's more types of mental states, namely the thoughts, than individual material states, material types of states. Okay, I did my best, John. If that was confusing, go to the articles. And
yes,
I know I said that even in ways that could be more precise.
Right.
But it's hard to do this in a non-technical way.
No, I thought that was a great start to it. And I liked how in the chapter you do it with shapes. You say, okay, think of a triangle, square, and a circle, 3 different shapes. And then we can have the thought about them and all the different permutations of the thoughts about them. Yeah. And we're going to end up with those collections, the thoughts about just the triangle, thoughts about the triangle and circle, thoughts about the triangle, square, and the circle. And you can multiply the collections and you end up with more of those than just the 3 shapes that we started with. And you're saying, let's do this on a grand scale. Because honestly, that is going to be the objection, is people are going to say, well, yeah, but couldn't it be that material states are possibly infinite in their geometric arrangement, in that, if you shift the neuron at an infinitesimal angle and you have this other structure that latches onto it and you combine geometric structures, couldn't we technically have an infinite number of different ways of doing these material brain states, or just material states in general? So it does seem like we have a way to produce the infinity. So therefore, can't we latch on to the infinite number of thoughts?
Yes, and that's right. And I think that you can have an infinite number, or at least potential, of the material states, right? But then you get a larger infinity because of Cantor's theorem. You can maybe explain this better than me at this point, because you're familiar with this concept. Do you want to?
Yeah, I love the example of, it was first demonstrated to me that the real numbers have a greater cardinality than the natural numbers in college. And I found that really impressive. And the word cardinality is what mathematicians in set theory use to talk about the different sizes of sets. And we say that sets can be infinite, but as one of my professors at Montclair State used to say, Dr. Mukherjee, not all infinities are created equal. That's what he would say. And that's kind of a hard concept to get across, because you can be a little skeptical of that. Like, well, really? And so Cantor's theorem, the way we learned it, I learned his diagonalization argument, which is one way of presenting the argument. And it is hard to get this across in a quick way, just through audio. But the notion is, if you write out all the different natural numbers and you make a list of them, you picture a giant list. And if things have the same cardinalities, just the natural numbers, if there's another set that's the same size in this way that we call cardinality, we should be able to match them up, one item in the first set, the natural numbers, to one item in the second set. Let's say it's the real numbers. And if you can line all of them up perfectly, I'm being a little bit loose, but we can be more technical. you get what's called a one-to-one correspondence, and that means the sets have the same size or the same cardinality. But what Cantor showed is, and it's kind of ingenious, if you're going to say that all of the numbers in this first set can line up with all the numbers in the second set, you should be able to, you kind of visualize it, list them both vertically.
Yeah, should be able to write them all
And
out.
for any number in the second list, you should be able to point back to the number in the first list that it matches up with. But the problem is when you try to do that with the real numbers, and I should actually go back to my undergrad notes because it's been a while since I've worked this out. If you go to that list of the real numbers, and remember, every number on that list is supposed to link back to a natural number. And I didn't say natural in the beginning. Sorry, I should have said that. Natural numbers are just 1, 2, 3, 4, the regular counting numbers, no decimals, no fractions. That's what we're talking about. And you can, what happens is you can find some number on the real numbers list. You can actually create one, call it X for a second. That's made by taking the list that you supposedly had lined up with the first list and changing all the digits along a diagonal. And when you do that and you change all the digits along the diagonal, what you find out is this new number X, because it was changed along the diagonal in every one of its digits, this is very technical and hard to explain, it ends up not matching up with any of the numbers on the first list.
The
And so
number
your
on the
ability,
diagonal, the number
yes,
defined by all the digits along the diagonal, is not itself going to be in the list, is I think what you're saying. So there's a
right,
leftover
exactly.
number. Yes.
Right, defined by the diagonal. And I have to double check all of that, but you end up with a number that's not on that initial list, and therefore you can't produce that one-to-one correspondence, and therefore they don't have exactly the same size. If that proof is right, and I think Cantor is right, and I think it's kind of cool to look at, then you're saying your counting argument really develops that with respect to material states and thoughts.
Yes. In one of my earlier versions, I actually have a footnote where I give Cantor's proof, except not in terms of diagonalization. I generalize it just in terms of pairing things with collections or plurals. And it is, again, it's very technical, and I don't even have it clear in my mind right now. But if that works, then what you get is this result, which I think is already kind of intuitive, that for any set of things, whether it's a set of a finite number of turtles or an infinite number of particles, the total number of elements in that set is always going to be less than the total number of ways of combining elements in that set. Because if you think about it intuitively, like just to give you a visual, if you have like an infinite number of turtles, let's say, and each has a number on it, like 1, 2, 3, all the way out, then then you've got all the natural numbers. But now, if you want to build a new set, you can build a new set by all the pairs of the turtles, all the triples, all the combinations of 4, all the combinations of 5. And that new set is just going to have a higher cardinality. That they're both infinite sets, but it's just going to have a higher cardinality. And so I use that exact method for defining these thoughts in terms of, let's say, geometric states, using the logical links like or and. That's what gives us the building power. So that for any set or collection of material states, we can get a unique thought that's about that particular collection. So that gives us more types of thoughts than types of material states. Yes.
I know. I appreciate that. We went into the weeds there for a few minutes, but that honestly was a lot of fun. Just remind us, summarize, like, so what is the conclusion that you think you're getting out of this counting argument?
So there's different conclusions, right? So one is that there's not a complete reduction, because I mean, anytime you have a thought, that thought has the property of being a thought. That's like the general property. But if thoughts in general don't reduce, if the types of thoughts don't reduce the types of material states, then there is a distinction there between just being a thought in any particular material state. Another conclusion was just going back to the hypothesis that the mindless generates the mental. If there's more mental than mindless, then you can't get that one-to-one correspondence. So what you have is that if this, let's just say for sake of argument, this mindless state generates this mental, and then this mindless state generates this mental, it's like, this mental, there's no mindless state left over to generate it. Now, the reason why that's a problem is because The only difference between these mental states is just in the logical links within them. They're equally logically possible in terms of what they are, in terms of their natures.
Mm.
And so this leads me to think, I motivate this in the book to think that there's a kind of uniformity that if any thought is able to exist or be defined without a material state that determines it, then all the thoughts should be in the same boat, so that all the thoughts should be able to exist in a sense free from the material states determining them. Now, when I say free from them, I don't mean they're not connected to materiality. Nothing I'm saying challenges a kind of neuroscientific observation of a deep connection between mind and body. I have a whole chapter about that. It's just that merely specifying the mindless molecules is not by itself sufficient
Mm.
to generate the thoughts. You need something else. Maybe you need some kind of law-like connection between the mindless materials, but then that law-like connection is not self material. In fact, the law, I would argue, reflects a deeper thinking or mentality within reality, if I could just use that language. But the point is that if you have more mental states than material states, then you can't get that one-to-one determination, so that each mental state comes from a distinct material state. Then by uniformity, you can infer that all mental states are able to arise free from material states that determine them. The material states maybe are part of the process, but they're not determining the mental state all on their own.
Mm.
That's the idea.
Okay, no, that's great. That's going to lead us into our closing thoughts here. I'm going to let you say a little bit more about the science issue, but this has been a lot of fun, Josh. I hope the book does super well. I look forward to exploring more of it on my own. But why don't I give you a little bit of time to address that worry and talk a little bit about the science, because some people might object that our whole conversation today was either not scientific enough or it's just incompatible with the
Yeah.
best neuroscience has to offer about minds and brains. So what would you say to people who have those worries?
So it's very interesting, John, because I've been reading a lot of the latest neuroscience talking about the nature of our brains, the nature of consciousness affecting our brains. And a lot of neuroscientists are talking about the power of consciousness to make physical differences into the structures of our brains. Now, that has to be interpreted. The scientists themselves are debating how to think about these studies. And a lot of it's very recent. So, I mean, I'll talk with people and they're not necessarily even aware of some of the latest stuff. And look, this isn't my expertise. So what I do is I bring to the table my tools of analysis. And what I want to argue is, if anything, the neuroscience is revealing that our consciousness has great power to affect material systems. I would even go so far as to say that what the latest science is showing us is that consciousness affects the material world, not even from the top down. I was mentioning this to you before the show. It's not just from the top down. People have this idea, this picture of mindless matter building complex things, and maybe there's this mysterious mental power that can now sort of act from the big down to the small. It looks to me that it's actually our consciousness is acting from the bottom up, that we are, in a significant sense, prior to even our material states. The material states themselves grow out of prior conscious states. And that when we have certain intentions, we're actually able to affect brain matter from the ground up by changing states of the quantum field. I've been reading Carlo Rovelli. He's a leading theorist in quantum field theory. And he's been talking about how the basic nature of matter is analyzed not in terms of shape, not in terms of space, not in terms of structure that's material in a sense that we understand, but in terms of informational states that give rise to the structure of matter itself. And informational states, this goes back to our observations about thoughts. Informational states, the paradigm examples of informational states are structures, including functional structures that we witness within our own thoughts. If I have the thought that if two things come together, then something will emerge. If there's this input, then there will be this output. That structure is a structure of a thought. So to me, it actually makes a lot of sense of our neuroscience that our thinking and our intending is able to affect states of the quantum field, these informational states that actually configure the material states in our brain. one of the books I read that was very helpful on this is a book called The Spiritual Brain. It's by two PhD neuroscientists. And what I liked about that book was that they point to a lot of the science that suggests that our mentality is able to cause changes to the brain without any known or identifiable purely material cause. So it looks like the mentality is driving the changes. Now, I don't want to push that argument too far because I think purely from an empirical standpoint, it's still open-ended because maybe you haven't identified the physical cause, but maybe there is a physical cause there. But I think that's the whole point of the tools that I'm bringing, is that the science, I think, is leaving open room for interpretation. But then when I'm bringing these tools of introspection and reason, I think that we can actually highlight some things that can inform the science. It's consistent with the science. In fact, I think the science is a second witness to this, but it also gets past the sort of controversy over how to interpret the empirical results. If I could just give one example of this, and this will kind of land the airplane on kind of my thoughts about science and our tools. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we can do consciousness experiments without going into the laboratory. So, John, literally, I've been having dreams where I know that I'm dreaming. I was actually adding this paragraph today. I was talking about the chapter on the power to choose, and I put this paragraph in because I've been doing this. I've been working on this book on consciousness, so I'll have these dreams. I know I'm dreaming. And I had this dream where I knew I was dreaming, and I thought, let me do an experiment. And I have this imagery of blue sky out there in my dream. This is about a month ago. And I thought, well, what can I do to change the scene? Can I make a ball? And so I intend to conjure up the image of a ball. And I don't know if it's just like because it's in a dream state, it's like easier. Like, because right now, if I try to get the image of a ball, I have to like close my eyes and maybe I can get it. But it came up. The image of a ball came up. And then I rotated the image across the screen of my mind, the visual screen of my mind. And I predicted, you know what, at that rate of rotation, it's going to exit my mind in about 4 seconds. I began counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Sure enough, about 4 seconds, it's gone out of my screen. Now, how am I able first to generate the conscious experience of the ball, but second, to make a prediction of how the consciousness is going to move across the screen of my mind without looking at any neuroscientific studies or even knowing about how the atoms in my brain are configured at that moment? Because like, think about that. I mean, at the moment that I'm conjuring up the image, my brain chemistry is doing something and I have no idea what it's doing. At least I don't know its shape or its function, none of that. But I do know about this image in my mind. And once I get it to rotate, I'm observing, well, I think at this rate of rotation, it's going to exit in 4 seconds. Now I'm making a prediction based on my experience of consciousness in my mind, not based on anything about atoms or chemical reactions. And the prediction came true, which means that my prediction was true. It matched reality. It matched the fact that that thing really was going to exit, and I could predict that. This tells me that whatever's going on in my brain, see, there's a kind of causal exclusion problem. If we say that that image was only generated deterministically from lower level atoms doing their thing, then how could I then consciously control that image? How could I make that image appear? Now, maybe you say, well, the atoms gave me the feeling of controlling the image. But okay, but then how do I come up with the specific prediction it's going to rotate? Oh, well, maybe the atoms caused me to come up with the prediction that the image is going to rotate off my mind. That's a complex explanation. It seems like a simpler explanation is just exactly how it looks. I'm able to control some things and make a difference, and I can predict the effects of that. And I think the neuroscience is testifying that when you form intentions, when you form if you focus on if you have positive thinking, you focus on things you're grateful for, there are things that happen in your brain, in the molecular structure of things that are connected to that. And I think a simple way of explaining that just is in terms of consciousness affecting material systems.
You know, I teach in a public school, and people are quick to accuse a lot of public schools of advocating just a very scientific, secular worldview of sorts. But I will tell you one thing that's all the rage in public education nowadays is this thing called growth mindset, which is based on what you're talking about, consciousness having effect on our brains, and neuroplasticity studies. And we're constantly telling our students, and I love it. Turns out if you tell people that they can grow their intelligence, you can get better at this. They always come in saying, "Oh, I'm not good at math. I could never do this. I could never do that." But we've been trained as teachers in the last 10 years to try to, as much as possible, advocate for this growth mindset, because it turns out if people believe that they can learn things,
Mhm.
the studies show that they do so much better. They perform way better, and they do increase their intelligence because of our ability, by thinking those thoughts of what we can do, can
Yeah.
actually form our neural structure in a better way to have better outcomes. So it's something that we are definitely preaching in math education. For anybody out there who's probably tempted to say after this episode, with some of those technical points, this is why I never liked math or never understood it. You can understand things, you can grow in your understanding. And I think that's just another area that
Yeah.
points to what you're talking about, how consciousness can have an effect on material structures. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Josh Rasmussen, I do want to kind of bring this to a close, but thank you so much for joining us today on the Classical Theism podcast. Let listeners know where they can go to check out more of your work. Obviously, we'll link to a bunch of things in the show notes page. Anything else you want to plug or closing remarks you want to make, and then we'll
Yeah.
say
Thank you.
goodbye.
This has been so wonderful. I really appreciate it. I mean, it is hard to stop because there's so much more that I want to share about the sort of mental structure of reality. And that, it's a big topic. There's so many different angles to think about here. And I really feel like your own consciousness is a window into a very special type of reality. And I don't think you can really overestimate the significance of the reality that you witness when you witness yourself waking up in the morning and you witness your thoughts and you're wondering kind of what to do and you're thinking about your plans. The fact that you can even think about a plan,
Mm.
the fact that you have that power already is a significant aspect of reality. I mean, there's a reason why philosophers have been tempted to eliminate the existence of conscious beings entirely, because the existence of conscious beings is so significant to the kind of reality we live in. And I really think just paying attention to your own consciousness, maybe a lot of things that we said here, maybe you have a different view on, maybe some of these things just raise questions for you, but it's like, I just want to invite people to just use your own lights of interest, like pay attention to your own feelings, inspect your thoughts, think about yourself from within, see what you can see. And I think that you will see more and more. And I think what you'll see is the most significant thing that you can see, which is all the value and treasures that are right within consciousness, yourself, and the kind of world that can produce you. So it's a big topic. But I know we have to be done here. So if you want to get more resources, I've got my website, joshualrasmussen.com. You mentioned the Worldview Design Training Center, and there's new resources we're going to be bringing into there soon. So I'm very excited about that. So yeah, anything on my website is there for free for people to find out more about me. And I hope that will serve you.
Excellent. Well, I will make sure to link to all of that in the show notes page. But thanks again for joining us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you.